Spring 1945. The war was still alive, but barely breathing. In the west, the once mighty German army was retreating across its own homeland, not in disciplined order, but in exhausted fragments. The wind carried the scent of damp soil, smoke, and something faintly sweet, the smell of apple blossoms blooming over fields cratered by artillery shells. Near Aachen, in the ruins of a former schoolhouse now serving as a field hospital, a handful of young German women in Red Cross armbands moved like ghosts through corridors lit by candles and fear. They were not soldiers, but they had been at the front longer than most men still standing. One of them, a 21-year-old nurse with straw-blonde hair pinned beneath her cap, rinsed her hands in a basin of muddy water. The soap had run out months ago. Her fingers smelled faintly of iodine and iron. She whispered a prayer for the boy on the cot before her, a Luftwaffe radio operator, maybe 18, his breath rattling, his uniform soaked in blood and rain. Around her, the others worked in silence, their movements measured, methodical, stripped of hope but still driven by duty. In their eyes, a single question lingered: what happens when the world you served disappears overnight? Outside, the sound of artillery had changed. It was no longer the long, confident thunder of German guns, but the dull, advancing heartbeat of the American front. 4 days, they had heard it draw closer, the whine of shells, the distant hum of jeeps, the alien rhythm of English voices on portable radios. Rumors slipped through the walls like smoke. That Hitler was hiding, that Berlin would soon fall, that the Americans treated prisoners well. Some said they gave captured Germans chocolate. Others laughed bitterly at that. No one had tasted sweetness in years. In the courtyard, snowmelt trickled through shattered tiles, forming small silver pools. A German officer stumbled in, mud to his knees, his arm in a sling. "They're here," he said simply. The nurses froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if obeying an invisible order, they began cleaning, folding blankets, bandaging wounds, adjusting caps, as though dignity itself might shield them from what was coming. Outside, engines idled. Boots crunched. Voices called out in clipped English. The hospital trembled. A window pane fell inward with a soft clink. When the Americans entered, they did not look like the monsters the propaganda posters had promised. They were tired, mud-caked men in olive-drab uniforms, helmets tilted back, eyes alert but not cruel. Their weapons hung loosely at their side. The commanding sergeant, perhaps 30 with a stubble-shadowed jaw, removed his gloves before stepping closer to the cots. He spoke through a translator. "No one move. You'll be safe." His tone was neither kind nor harsh, simply factual, like a man exhausted by too many truths. For the women, the moment was surreal. Too many truths. For the women, the moment was surreal. These were the enemy, and yet they had come not with vengeance, but with medical kits. One soldier crouched beside the wounded radio operator, checked his pulse, and gave him a sip of water from his canteen. The young nurse's hand shook as she reached to help. Their eyes met for an instant, hers wide with disbelief, his calm, perhaps pitying. He nodded once, a silent reassurance. "You're done fighting." She didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until the air left her lungs like a confession. By dusk, the war had shrunk to a quiet hum. Outside, the Americans raised white flags over the compound for the planes above. The nurses gathered near the doorway, watching the sky tint itself lavender over the ruins. They were now prisoners, not of cruelty but of history itself. The sergeant approached them again, his voice even. "You'll be processed tomorrow. Medical staff first." They nodded, unsure whether to thank him. One of them murmured, half to herself, "It's strange, they look just like our boys." No one answered. That night, the nurses slept on clean straw for the first time in weeks. The guns had stopped. Only the wind moved through the broken windows, carrying the faint sound of an American harmonica somewhere beyond the walls. One woman, older than the rest, a former matron from Cologne, whispered into the dark that she could smell bread baking. The others laughed softly, thinking it was a dream. But the next morning, when the Americans distributed rations, they handed out real bread, soft, warm, and foreign. The women ate in silence, each bite a reminder that survival was now something awkward, almost shameful. By noon, trucks arrived. They were told they would be taken to a holding camp near Andernach for temporary internment. The word sounded sterile, harmless, but none of them knew what it meant. They packed what little they had, letters, rosaries, scraps of fabric. The young nurse tucked a photograph of her family into her apron. The boy she'd treated the day before was gone. A soldier said he'd been moved to another camp. She didn't ask which. There were no tears, only a slow acceptance, like stepping into cold water. As they were escorted out, the town looked unrecognizable. Streets once filled with marching boots now lay quiet except for the clatter of American trucks and the laughter of children chasing after them for candy. The women walked in lines, mud streaking their skirts, eyes down. Civilians watched from doorways, some sneering, some indifferent, a few crossing themselves. War had blurred the lines between guilt and survival. A child whispered, "Are they nurses?" and his mother pulled him inside. At the checkpoint, a young American handed each woman a metal tag and a canteen of water. He hesitated before offering a faint smile to the blonde nurse. She didn't return it, but after he walked away, she looked down at the tag in her hand, the number stamped deep into the metal. It glinted in the sunlight like a small promise that she still existed. Around her, the sky had turned an impossible blue, the kind that only appears after too much rain. That evening, as they reached the camp perimeter, she saw the flags, American, Red Cross, and a faded German one taken from a captured garrison. The air smelled of diesel, disinfectant, and wet grass. Beyond the barbed wire, tents spread across the hillside in neat rows. It was not what she had imagined captivity to be. Men in clean uniforms stood guard, but there was no shouting, no blows, only quiet efficiency. The women were told they would receive food, water, and medical check. They nodded, uncertain whether to believe. One of them whispered that she'd heard the Americans gave their prisoners blankets. Another said, and soap. Real soap. The word hung in the air like a distant echo of civilization itself. The nurse lifted her eyes toward the horizon, where the last traces of daylight brushed against smoke rising from the town they had left behind. Her stomach twisted, not from fear, but from the ache of finally stopping after running for so long. She thought of her hands, still stained with dried blood, and wondered when she would feel clean again. As night fell and the camp gates closed behind them, a faint breeze carried something unexpected through the air, something soft, unfamiliar, almost sweet. She turned her head slightly, catching it for a moment before it vanished. It smelled, impossibly, like flowers. And though she couldn't be sure, she thought it came from inside the camp. Morning light fell over the Andernach hills like a soft gold veil. Dew sparkled on the barbed wire as mist drifted between the rows of tents. The war was officially over, but the air still trembled with its ghost. Inside the women's section of the POW camp, 50 German Red Cross nurses woke to the metallic clang of the breakfast bell. Some blinked toward the rising sun, uncertain whether to feel relief or humiliation. They had surrendered their freedom, but not their humanity, at least, not yet. The young nurse with the straw-blonde hair from Aachen rubbed her arms against the cold. Her uniform had been scrubbed so often it was nearly white. The American guards were brisk, efficient, almost polite, but their language, their posture, their laughter at the gates made everything feel foreign. When the women lined up for rations, steam from tin pots mingled with the scent of burned coffee and boiled potatoes. It was edible, even generous by wartime standards, but her mind clung to something simpler. Clean water. Soap. To wash away months of grime and guilt. That afternoon, supply trucks rattled into camp. Crates marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Hygiene were unloaded near the medical tent. The guards opened them carefully, pulling out bars wrapped in waxed paper. Pale yellow, stamped with English letters the women couldn't read. The sergeant in charge barked a few short orders, then nodded to the translator. Issue one per person. They'll need it. The translator, a Swiss Red Cross worker, smiled faintly. They'll remember this, he said. When the first bar was handed out, no one moved. The women looked at it as though it were gold. The blonde nurse held hers to the light, studying the faint embossing, palmolive. The color reminded her of butter in springtime. She lifted it to her face and inhaled. The scent struck her like a memory she'd forgotten she had. Flowers after rain, linen hung in sunlight, childhood before uniforms. Tears pricked her eyes. She laughed. A sound so... Tears pricked her eyes. She laughed. A sound so small it startled even her. The others watched, then one by one raised their own bars. Within seconds, soft laughter rippled through the crowd. It smells like flowers, someone cried in German, and the phrase echoed down the line until even the guards turned to look. It was a strange moment. No speeches, no ceremony, just women holding soap to their faces as if breathing in a lost world. A few of the American soldiers smiled, embarrassed but moved. One muttered to another, "They act like it's perfume." The other replied, "After what they've been through, maybe it is." Soon, the camp was alive with water and sunlight. Buckets clattered, tin basins filled, sleeves rolled up. The nurse knelt by the trough and rubbed the bar between her hands until it foamed into white softness. The bubbles gleamed against her skin, pale as snow. For the first time in months, she felt clean. Around her, laughter turned into singing, fragments of old folk songs carried on the wind. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was survival, washed and reborn. American medics passed by, watching curiously. Some of them had sisters back home. They recognized the gestures. The way women brushed soap over their arms, the way they smiled shyly when caught doing something tender. One medic, a boy from Ohio, later wrote in a letter, "They looked like any girls on a summer day, except there were rifles behind them." That was the strange truth of the camp. Beneath the discipline and wire, the war had paused just long enough for humanity to breathe. Evening brought inspection. The guards noted improved morale. Hygiene restored, no incidents, the report would later read. But what it meant inside those fences was different. Clean hands, clean faces, and for a fleeting moment, clean hearts. The nurses gathered near the fence as the sun sank over the Rhine. The blonde nurse rubbed the bar against her palm one last time before setting it beside her bedroll, wrapped in cloth like a treasure. She whispered to her friend, "It's as if the world smells good again." Her friend nodded. "Maybe it always did. We just forgot." The next days blurred into quiet routines. Laundry lines stretched between posts. Soap bubbles caught the light like tiny lanterns. The Americans brought more supplies. Combs, toothbrushes, even a few tins of powder. Rumor spread that the Red Cross would inspect soon. The camp commander wanted it spotless. Yet beneath the orderliness, unease lingered. Some prisoners whispered that the Allies wouldn't let them go home, that Germany was gone, that they'd spend years behind fences. Clean skin did little to wash away that fear. Still, something subtle shifted between captor and captive. When the women lined up for rations, guards began greeting them with a nod. One afternoon, the same sergeant who'd issued the soap passed the nurse by the well. He paused, removed his helmet, and asked in halting German, "Alles gut?" She hesitated, then answered softly, "Job gut." He gave a curt smile and walked on. It wasn't much, but in that tiny exchange lived the fragile miracle of post-war peace. Rain fell that night, drumming on the canvas roof. The scent of soap mingled with wet earth. Some women dreamed of home, others feared there was no home left. The nurse lay awake, tracing circles on the bar of soap beside her pillow, its fragrance fading but still there, a reminder that someone, somewhere, believed they deserved to be clean again. That simple mercy unsettled her. Why would the enemy give comfort? What were they trying to prove? She turned over the question until dawn, when bugles called them back to line. Days became weeks. The Americans replaced sentries. The Swiss Red Cross delivered letters from families. News filtered through. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. The women stood in silence, hearing the words as if from underwater. Some wept quietly. Others stared into the distance, unable to grasp a world without orders, without flags. The nurse clutched the soap in her hand until her knuckles whitened. It was absurd, she thought, to hold on to something so small when everything else had vanished. Yet she did. Later that evening, she watched two guards sharing cigarettes by the fence, laughing about baseball. The sound was ordinary, harmless. It filled the space where gunfire once lived. She wondered if mercy could be this mundane. Just people washing, talking, existing side by side without the weight of ideology. Maybe that was the truest kind of victory. Not parades or speeches, but decency surviving when no one demanded it. At sunset, a Red Cross truck arrived with more crates. The soldiers unloaded them quickly. More soap, more supplies. One bar fell into the mud near the nurse's feet. She picked it up, wiped it clean, and saw a faint imprint of flowers pressed into the paper wrapper. She smiled, then looked toward the gate where the guards stood silhouetted against the dying light. For a heartbeat, she imagined walking beyond that fence, carrying the scent of lavender into the world again. But the whistle blew, and the gates closed for the night. In the dark, she held the soap close and whispered a single thought, half prayer, half promise, that someday when she was free she would tell someone about this, how even in captivity, kindness had a fragrance. The air around her was quiet except for the rustle of tents and the faint sweetness drifting from the wash area. Tomorrow, the Americans said, they would be moved east to another camp. She didn't know what awaited them there. But as she breathed in the last trace of that delicate scent, she realized it no longer smelled just of flowers. It smelled, impossibly, of forgiveness. Rain came to the camp like an old song, soft at first, then steady, seeping into the earth and into every canvas seam. The nurses woke to the scent of damp soil and the rhythmic drumming on their tent roof. Days had blurred together, stitched by routine and silence, but the rain broke it apart. It softened the edges of the fences, dulled the metallic smell of wire and rust, and made the camp seem, for a few hours, almost human. The blonde nurse sat by the entrance flap, her bar of soap wrapped carefully in cloth beside her. It had become more than a thing. It was proof that something gentle could exist in the ruins of war. The women had been moved to a smaller section of the camp now, near the infirmary. Their work, helping to treat sick and injured German prisoners, had earned them small privileges. Cleaner quarters, longer walks, conversation with the guards. Yet those freedoms carried unease. They were still prisoners, their lives dictated by whistles, schedules, and watchtowers. The Americans were not cruel, but they were distant, disciplined. Their kindness was a wall of its own, polite but impassable. One wrong word, one gesture of pride, could shatter it. Everyone knew that. The camp's infirmary smelled of iodine, sweat, and rain-soaked wool. The nurse moved through rows of stretchers, tending to wounded men who had once worn the same uniform as her brothers. Some had been officers, others mere conscripts. Now all were stripped of rank. One of them, a boy of 16 with fever-flushed cheeks, clutched her wrist as she tried to change his bandage. "Do they hate us?" he whispered. She hesitated, glancing toward the American medic nearby, a tall man with kind eyes who was checking supplies. "No," she said softly. "Not all of them." The boy released her hand, his breathing easing. When she looked up again, the medic was watching her. He nodded once, as if to say he understood. That evening, the rain stopped. Puddles reflected the barbed wire like tangled stars. A few guards shared cigarettes near the gate, the orange glow of their embers flickering in the dusk. The women gathered in small clusters, mending clothes, humming tunes that once belonged to dances and peacetime kitchens. The nurse sat apart, scrubbing her hands in a basin of cloudy water. The soap had worn down to a thin oval, smooth as a river stone. She didn't use it often. She was afraid of losing it entirely. Across the fence, one of the guards waved to her, a young man no older than 20. He mimed washing his hands, grinning. She blinked, uncertain whether to smile back, but did. It was the first time she'd smiled at an American. As weeks passed, small gestures began to fill the gaps between enemy lines. A medic left a tin of salve on the nurse's table without a word. A guard returned a dropped handkerchief, folded neatly. When food was short, the Americans quietly shared extra bread from their own rations. None of it was officially permitted. But in that strange limbo between surrender and peace, rules bent to the weight of decency. The women stopped flinching when English voices called out. They started learning simple words: thank you, good, yes. The nurse learned one more: forgive. She practiced it under her breath, though she wasn't sure whom it was for. Still, not all moments were kind. One morning, news spread through the camp. Photographs from liberated concentration camps had reached the American newspapers. The guards' moods changed overnight. Where they had once been cordial, now they grew cold, silent. One tore down the laundry line that had crossed too near the outer fence. Another barked at a woman for lingering by the gate. The nurse sensed the shift like a chill in the wind. She didn't know what the photographs showed, only that they made the world heavier. The Americans looked at them differently after that, not as nurses or prisoners, but as faces of something too vast to name. Days later, the medic who had nodded at her in the infirmary came again, his expression distant. He spoke to her through the translator, asking about supplies. When their eyes met, she saw conflict in his, disbelief, sorrow, and a kind of reluctant respect. "You didn't know," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She shook her head, unsure whether he meant the camps or the war itself. He turned away before she could answer. That night she couldn't sleep. Rain returned, heavier this time, washing the earth into rivulets that glowed faintly under lightning. She whispered to the dark, "We didn't know." The words felt too small against the noise of the storm. The next morning, the Americans reopened the infirmary gate. The medic was there again, this time offering gloves and gauze. He didn't speak, but when she reached for the supplies, their fingers brushed. For a moment they looked at each other, not as victors and vanquished, but as two human beings suspended between guilt and grace. Then he pulled back, clearing his throat. "You do good work," he said in halting German. She nodded, replying in English, "You too." The simplicity of it made him smile faintly before he walked away. She watched him go, the word forgive echoing in her mind like a fragile bridge no one had yet dared to cross. As summer deepened, the camp transformed. Grass grew between the barrack. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the path. The women planted small gardens outside their tents, tomatoes, marigolds, lavender. The nurse tended hers carefully, watering it from the same bucket she used to wash. The air began to smell faintly of earth and green things, mingling with the fading scent of her soap. One afternoon, she caught sight of the medic watching from afar. She held up a sprig of lavender, smiling shyly. He raised his hand in greeting but didn't approach. Even kindness, it seemed, had borders. Letters began to arrive, some from home, some returned unopened. One nurse received word that her village no longer existed. Another learned her fiancé had died in a Soviet camp. The nurse from Aachen received nothing at all. She started writing her own letter instead, not to anyone living, but to herself. A confession of what she had seen, what she hadn't stopped, what she wished she could forget. "I will remember the smell of flowers," she wrote, "because it was proof that we were still human." When she finished, she tucked it inside the wrapper of her soap and hid it beneath her cot. By August, whispers spread that some prisoners would be released soon. The Americans had begun repatriation lists. Hope crept back in like sunlight through torn fabric. But for many, including the nurses, there was hesitation. What waited beyond the fences? A broken homeland, suspicion, maybe worse. Inside the camp, they had found a fragile peace. Outside it lay a country they no longer recognized. On the last night before inspection, the nurse stood by the fence, staring at the river. Fireflies drifted above the grass, their glow soft and uncertain. She thought of the medic, of the boy who'd asked if they were hated, of her own hands, once trembling, now steady. The war had taken almost everything, but not that small steadiness. Not yet. A guard's voice called lights out. She turned toward the tents, the air heavy with lavender and damp earth. In her pocket, the bar of soap was now just a sliver, worn thin but still fragrant. She closed her fingers around it, breathing deeply as the night settled in. Tomorrow, she might learn her fate. But tonight, surrounded by wire and watchtowers, she felt something she hadn't in years, a quiet certainty that being clean was not just of the body, but of the soul. Somewhere in the dark, an American harmonica began to play, slow and mournful. She listened until sleep claimed her, not realizing that by dawn, the gates would open, not for punishment, but for something far more complicated: mercy. Summer 1945 arrived quietly, as if unsure it had permission to exist. The war was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. At the Andernach camp, wildflowers grew tall along the wire fences, softening their outlines. The river shimmered nearby, carrying pieces of the old world downstream. For the women within the camp, time had slowed into a rhythm of waiting, waiting for news, for release, for something resembling forgiveness. The nurse from Aachen woke before dawn each day, her cot pressed against the tent wall. The soap she kept wrapped in cloth was nearly gone, its scent faint but persistent. Each morning she lifted it to her nose, as if testing whether mercy could fade. By July, the Americans had begun repatriating the first groups of prisoners. Trucks lined up along the dirt road outside the compound, their canvas tops flapping in the breeze. Women whispered to one another, wondering whose names were on the list. Some wanted to go home, others feared what home had become. The nurse felt both. She dreamed of her mother's kitchen, the smell of bread and clean linen, but in the dream, the house was always empty. When the Red Cross officer finally read her name aloud, she felt her knees weaken. She had longed for this moment, yet now it filled her with unease. Freedom was a word that no longer felt safe. The morning of departure was warm and gold. The women lined up with their few belongings: blankets, letters, keepsakes. The nurse's bundle was small: a comb, her photograph, the sliver of soap wrapped carefully in handkerchief fabric. At the gate, an American medic stood with a clipboard, his sleeves rolled up, his face tanned from months in the field. It was the same man she had worked beside in the infirmary. When she stepped forward, he looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, afraid to take it. "It's just soap," he added, smiling faintly. "The good kind." She accepted it with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered in English. "You're welcome," he replied, and for the first time, she believed he meant it. The truck jolted forward, its wheels kicking up dust. From the back, the women watched the camp recede, the fences, the tents, the guards now only silhouettes in the sunlight. None of them spoke. It wasn't joy that filled the air, but something quieter, heavier, the knowledge that kindness could wound as much as cruelty, because it forced them to remember what they had almost forgotten, that the enemy had hearts too. The nurse pressed the new bar of soap against her chest, breathing in its faint lavender scent. It smelled not of captivity, but of something impossibly rare: grace. Their journey home was slow, winding through the wreckage of the Rhineland. Bridges hung broken over rivers, towns were shells of brick and silence. At every checkpoint, the American soldiers waved them through with calm efficiency, handing out water and bread. The women thanked them in halting English, surprised each time by the gentleness of it all. In one village, children peeked from doorways, their eyes wide at the sight of returning prisoners. No one cheered, but no one spat either. The world had grown too tired for hatred. When the nurse reached Aachen, she found the hospital where she once worked reduced to rubble. Only the iron frame of the doorway remained, twisted like a skeleton. The garden behind it had sprouted wild daisies, their white heads nodding in the wind. She sat there for a long time, unwrapping the soap the medic had given her. The wrapper was stamped U.S. Army lavender. She broke a small piece and rubbed it between her fingers, watching the foam bloom like milk. The scent rose softly, mingling with the flowers. For a moment, she closed her eyes and felt clean again, though tears blurred the world around her. Weeks turned into months. The nurse found work at a small clinic run by British relief doctors. They treated civilians, children with malnutrition, old men with hollow eyes. She moved through the ward quietly, her presence steady, unremarkable. Sometimes the patients asked if she had served in the war. She always answered, yes, as a nurse, and left it at that. But at night, when she washed her hands, she still used the American soap. The scent filled the empty room, faint and floral, a reminder that goodness could survive the ashes. Letters began circulating from former prisoners describing their experiences. Some spoke bitterly, others gratefully. A few mentioned the Americans' restraint, their curious civility. They treated us like people, one wrote, and that was more confusing than cruelty. The nurse copied that line into her diary. It was true, mercy could be disarming. It asked for no repayment, offered no defense. It left one standing exposed, forced to confront the possibility that war had not destroyed everything after all. One afternoon in early autumn, a package arrived at the clinic, supplies from the Red Cross. Bandages, medicine, and small hygiene kits stamped with English lettering. Inside were more bars of soap, identical to the one she'd kept. Her hands trembled as she lifted one out. It smelled the same, lavender and lemon, faintly sweet. She placed it on the sink in the children's ward. That evening, when she helped a little girl wash her hands, the child smiled and said, "It smells like flowers." The nurse froze, her throat tightening. The words echoed perfectly, as if time had folded back on itself. She smiled through tears and said softly, "Yes, it does." The camp felt far away now, yet sometimes she dreamed of it still. The wire, the rain, the harmonica at night. But in the dream, the fences always opened, and the scent of soap drifted outward like mist, covering the land. She would wake with that fragrance lingering in her hair and wonder if forgiveness could truly spread like that, quietly, invisibly, across borders and decades. She began writing again, not for herself this time, but for others. In a letter published in a small post-war journal, she wrote, "They gave us food, shelter, and soap. But what they really gave us was proof that decency can outlive any flag." Years later, historians would find testimonies like hers in dusty archives. Simple accounts, brief paragraphs about American-run camps in the Rhineland. Few would notice the poetry hidden in those lines, the way an act as ordinary as washing could become sacred. But for those who lived it, the memory endured like scent on skin. The war had stripped them of almost everything, yet it could not erase the fragile fragrance of mercy that lingered long after the uniforms were burned. That winter, as the first snow fell over Aachen, the nurse walked to the riverbank. The water was cold, dark, endless. She broke the last fragment of her soap and let it slip into the current. It dissolved instantly, vanishing beneath the surface. She stood there watching until the ripples disappeared, then whispered a quiet goodbye, not to the war, but to the part of herself that had needed it. Behind her, the wind carried the faintest hint of lavender across the frozen air. If she had turned then, she might have seen the small boy from the clinic waving from the path, calling her name. Instead, she stayed for one last moment by the water, breathing deeply. Somewhere far away, perhaps in another camp, another soldier or nurse might be holding the same bar of soap, catching the same scent. The thought made her smile. The world was wounded, yes, but still capable of tenderness. And as she walked back toward the lights of the city, the fragrance followed her, soft and persistent, as if mercy itself refused to let go.